Yes, we can see it.
All right,
Thank you.
great. So I'm going to be talking about some new findings from my lab about non-autistic adults' perceptions of autistic cognitive abilities. These findings are from the dissertation project of Kylie Debrabander. She's a doctoral student in my lab. So you can see her name here and follow her work. All right. As most of you know, there's been countless research over the past 40 years trying to better understand the mechanisms of social disability and autism. By and large, these studies have been pretty reductive and have focused on isolating neurobiological, cognitive, or behavioral differences in autism that are believed to underlie social disability. This approach reduces the complexities of social dynamics to individual characteristics and naturally leads to a deficit framing in which the perceived deficiencies of the autistic person are the primary cause of social disability, and thus treatment prioritizes correcting these deficits. My own area of study, social cognition, is kind of a microcosm of this issue. Many elegant and highly precise experimental studies using eye tracking, neuroimaging, and other techniques have exhaustively demonstrated that autistic people perceive and interpret social information in different ways than non-autistic people. However, using social cognition and social skill as some treatment target in the hopes that remediating or normalizing them will lessen autistic people's social disability and improve their outcomes largely has not been effective. One likely reason for this is that social cognitive research has not really been very social at all. It often asks people to make judgments of pictures or videos or lie in an fMRI scanner or measure where they're looking on the screen, but it rarely actually measures social interaction. This kind of reductive work may be useful experimentally to control for the influences of outside variables, but it ignores how social cognitive processes manifest in the messy and less controlled real world. Social cognitive research has also been one-sided, focusing on how autistic people may struggle to understand non-autistic people without acknowledging that the reverse is true as well. Only recently has an empirical literature begun to accumulate demonstrating that non-autistic people also struggle to understand autistic people. Miscommunication and disconnection is relational and bidirectional, an idea that, of course, that is central to the double empathy problem and has long been discussed among autistic people and written about by autistic writers, but really hadn't often been tested experimentally in autism research, but thankfully that's starting to change. So I thought I'd start by reviewing some of the studies we've done supporting the double empathy framework. About 7 or 8 years ago, long before I became very familiar with double empathy as a concept, we had measured autistic traits in college freshmen who were placed together as roommates and tracked their relationship development. And what we found is that autistic social traits didn't uniformly predict poor relationships among roommates. It was the compatibility of those traits between roommates that was predictive. So if one roommate had lower social motivation, for instance, that only predicted bad relationships if the other roommate had high social motivation. When they both had autistic social traits, they were perfectly happy together. What this means is that having autistic social traits doesn't predict relationship development. It was the combination across the two roommates that matter. Such findings are inconsistent with the social deficit model, but completely consistent with the double empathy theory. In another early study, we kind of flipped autism social cognitive research on its head to examine how autistic emotional expressions were perceived by non-autistic people rather than the usual examination of autistic people's perceptions of everyone else. We collected images of the emotional expressions of autistic and non-autistic people, not just posed ones, but evoked ones too, that were captured as they actually felt a specific emotion. And it turned out, contrary to notions of flat affect in autism, non-autistic people recognized autistic people's emotional states just fine in this context, but they still were rating them as exaggerated and less natural. When we replicated these findings later in another modality, emotional speech, using acoustic analysis, we found that autistic emotional speech tended to be louder, longer in duration, and had more pitch variability than non-autistic speech. But again, raters, this time both autistic and non-autistic raters, were able to recognize the emotion in the speech. But people, including autistic people in this study, rated autistic emotional expression in the voice as less natural. These studies were the seeds for me to start thinking about how perceptions of autistic social and emotional expressivity could affect the experiences of autistic people. And this all came together in a paper we published in 2017 on the first impressions of autistic adults. First impressions of unfamiliar people are a consequential social evaluative process. They are formed within seconds and strongly influence our social decisions and behavior, like if we decide to approach somebody or avoid them. We found that after watching 10-second video recordings, non-autistic adults rated autistic people as more awkward, less attractive, less likable relative to non-autistic controls, but not less intelligent or any less trustworthy. But perhaps more importantly, non-autistic adults reported significantly less interest in future social interaction with autistic adults in several ways, including a lower desire to hang out with them. And their negative trait judgments, like their awkwardness rating, strongly predicted their reluctance to interact with them. And what were non-autistic people using to make this decision? Turns out it was very clear that it was the visual and auditory cues, not the content of what the autistic adults were saying, that drove these negative impressions. In other words, it was the style, not substance. Autistic adults were rated less favorably than non-autistic adults when the whole video and audio was shown, when it was just the audio of their voice, when it was the video with no audio, and even when it was just a static image taken from the video. However, ratings between the groups didn't differ when impressions were based on a transcript of what the participants were saying. In a follow-up study, we found that telling non-autistic raters that a person is autistic before they rate them reduces but doesn't eliminate the negative first impressions they receive. We think this is happening because knowing the diagnosis provides the rater with an explanation for social presentations they perceive as different, and so they become a bit more accepting of those differences when they know about the diagnosis. Importantly, we found in this study that non-autistic adults with more autism knowledge were the ones who rated autistic adults more favorably. This gave us the idea that familiarity with autism may over time be able to reduce autism stigma and improve inclusion for autistic people. And who has more autism knowledge than autistic people themselves? In another study led by Kylie, we tested how autistic people rated other autistic people. And we found that autistic adults tended to rate the traits of autistic people similarly to how non-autistic raters do. But importantly, they reported a greater interest in interacting with them. What this means is that we find less of an association between trait evaluation and social interest among our autistic raters. How non-autistic raters evaluated people's traits, like whether they thought the person was awkward, was highly predictive of whether they wanted to interact with them. But that didn't occur for autistic raters. And unlike non-autistic raters, providing a diagnosis didn't change autistic people's ratings. They rated autistic people the same whether or not they were told the person was autistic. Maybe they could tell already, or maybe the label just isn't as consequential for how they view other autistic people. But what about real world interaction? All the studies I mentioned so far are artificial to some degree. People are evaluating other people from videos and not from meeting them in person. So we next took our studies into the real world and found that following a get to know you conversation between unfamiliar conversation partners, that autistic adults were rated as more awkward and less socially warm by both non-autistic and autistic partners. And we saw, and as we saw in our prior studies, non-autistic adults expressed greater social interest in non-autistic partners relative to autistic ones. But autistic partners didn't share that bias, and actually they trended towards greater social interest in autistic partners relative to non-autistic ones. They also reported disclosing more about themselves to autistic compared to non-autistic partners, and of course such findings are inconsistent with a deficit model that would predict even worse social interaction between two autistic partners. But we found the opposite, in some respects enhanced interaction. Of course, these findings are entirely consistent with the double empathy model. In another study led by Desi Jones, a student in my lab, we tested whether an autism acceptance training module featuring the first-person narratives of autistic people describing their experiences and challenges could improve non-autistic people's perceptions of autism in autistic people. And it turns out that it did reduce explicit biases. It reduced some misconceptions about autism. It improved perception of autistic abilities. It increased interest in interacting with both real and hypothetical autistic people. But the training didn't affect implicit biases at all. Non-autistic people, regardless of what training we gave them, continued to associate autism-related terms with unpleasant personal attributes. Affecting these underlying beliefs likely requires something more sustained and substantial than the training session that we used. And more recently, Desi tested whether the autism acceptance training affects how non-autistic people interact with autistic people in the real world. She found that when we apply this training to real world interaction, it produces fewer benefits than in the previous study using video recordings. But both the non-autistic and autistic partners in this new real world study reported greater interest in hanging out with each other when the non-autistic person had first completed the training. Very interestingly, we also found that non-autistic adults showed a large correspondence between how they rated their partner and how they rated the quality of the interaction. But autistic participants didn't show this. This again suggests that autistic people demonstrate more separation in how they evaluate people's traits and how they evaluate interactions. So this leads me to presenting for the first time some new findings I wanted to share with you. They come from Kylie's dissertation, which she'll be defending in about 2 weeks' time. The title of her project is Perceptions, Meta-Perceptions, and Cognitive Estimations of Autistic Adults Across Personal and Professional Contexts. That's a lot, and there's at least 3 projects here in one, but I'm going to focus on just one aspect here today. All of the first impression studies I've discussed so far focus on subjective judgments of the perceiver. Do they think the person they're rating is awkward or likable or trustworthy? And this can vary from person to person based on their preferences, expectations, and values. For instance, what it means to rate someone as awkward may differ for autistic and non-autistic raters. It's an ambiguous term without a concrete definition, and it can vary depending on the eye of the beholder. But what about more objective abilities? Are raters able to accurately predict them based on brief glimpses of a person? One aspect we were interested in is cognitive performance. We've had many autistic and non-autistic adults in our studies complete cognitive and intellectual assessments, and we were curious whether non-autistic adults misperceive or underestimate the cognitive performance of autistic adults. If so, that would have important implications above and beyond their subjective first impression judgments. So what Kylie did was collect videos and cognitive performance from a new sample of autistic and non-autistic stimulus participants. There were 21 in each group, and they didn't differ significantly on age, measured IQ, sex, or race. Using a new sample here also allowed us to try to replicate some of our previous first impression studies in a different set of autistic and non-autistic adults. She then recruited a very large sample of university students as raters. The majority were female, and it was a racially diverse group, as is the University of Texas at Dallas, where we conduct this research. Stimulus participants were video recorded across 6 different contexts, including a job interview, dating, class project, being a friend, discussing an interest, and a TV audition. Stimulus participants also completed 3 social cognitive and 3 general cognitive tasks that I'll show you here in a second. Later, raters provided their first impressions of the stimulus participants and viewed each of the 6 tasks and tried to predict how they think the stimulus participant did. We then compared participants' actual performance to their predicted performance. We selected commonly used social cognitive tasks representing 3 subdomains of social cognition: emotion recognition, face perception, and theory of mind, or inferring what others are thinking. On the ER40, participants have to select the emotion they believe is being expressed on the face. Some items are subtle, like this one. On the Bitten task of face recognition, participants have to select the face on the bottom that matches the identity of the one on the top. Items get progressively more difficult in terms of changes to orientation and lighting. On the Tacit, participants watch short videos of scripted social interactions and answer questions about the thoughts, intentions, and beliefs of the people in those videos. It includes social cues like lies and sarcasm. We next selected 3 established general cognitive tasks measuring different cognitive skills like reasoning, working memory, and spatial perception. On the matrix reasoning task, participants have to complete the matrix by selecting the item that completes the pattern. On the digit span task, an experimenter recites a string of numbers and the participant is asked to repeat them in order, and these strings get longer as the task goes on. And on the line orientation task measuring spatial perception, participants have to match 2 lines at the bottom to the correct angle orientation in the 13-line array at the top. So first, here are the results of the group's objective performance on the tasks. Consistent with previous findings, the non-autistic group performed better than the autistic group on 2 of those 3 social cognitive tasks, but there was no significant difference on the Bitten task of facial recognition. On the general cognitive task, the groups didn't differ on the line orientation task measuring spatial perception or on the matrix reasoning task, but the non-autistic group did perform better on the digit span task. And here is how non-autistic raters predicted performance on the tasks for autistic and non-autistic participants. On all 6 tasks, the raters thought the autistic participants would perform worse than the non-autistic participants. And if you remember the previous slide I just showed, you'll know that they appear then to be underestimating the performance of the autistic groups on 3 of the tasks where they objectively perform no differently from non-autistic participants. But we wanted to dig in deeper to figure out how and when non-autistic raters may be misperceiving cognitive performance. We use something called the truth and bias model to assess the accuracy and bias of rater predictions. Accuracy is how well they predicted which participants did better than other participants, and bias refers to how much they over or underestimated participant performance. First, we found that raters were generally pretty accurate at determining which participants did better than others. This means that brief glimpses of people is sufficient for some general cognitive estimation. But raters were less accurate for autistic participants than non-autistic ones. We think it may be that non-autistic raters are less familiar with autistic social presentations and less able to infer cognitive ability from them. It's likely that NA raters, non-autistic raters, associated some aspect of autistic participants' non-normative social communication, expressivity, and presentations with perceived lower cognitive ability. Such an interpretation is, of course, consistent with the double empathy framework. We measured bias to test this idea further, and indeed, raters did underestimate participant performance and did so significantly more for autistic participants. Interestingly, raters underestimated autistic participants more on the social cognitive tasks compared to the general cognitive tasks. Finally, we also found that how participants were rated on first impressions was significantly associated with their perceived cognitive performance. Generally speaking, participants who were rated less favorably on traits and on social interests were perceived to be less cognitively capable. Though one item showed a very unique pattern. Higher ratings of awkwardness were associated with predicting worse social cognitive performance, but actually associated with predicting significantly higher general cognitive performance. It worked differently than the other trait items. So what does this all mean? Well, first, we think this shows that the less favorable first impressions of autistic adults that we've demonstrated previously extend beyond subjective evaluations. What we're showing here for the first time is that non-autistic adults form less accurate and more biased impressions of autistic people. Underestimation of autistic cognitive ability by non-autistic adults has important implications. It could contribute to exclusionary and discriminatory practices that construct barriers in school and professional settings. It's especially interesting that underestimation of autistic performance was larger for social cognition. Underestimation of autistic people's social cognitive abilities could manifest in ways that affect autistic people in real-world scenarios, like being perceived as less capable relationship partners, collaborators, or employees. Interestingly, we have previously found that autistic participants themselves underestimate their own social cognitive performance on these tasks, which may to some degree reflect internalized beliefs of poor social ability in autism. You may be wondering what we would have found if autistic raters were included here. Would they be more accurate in predicting autistic people's cognitive performance? Maybe their greater familiarity and understanding of autistic communication and expressivity would result in less biased assessments. Such a finding would definitely align with the double empathy theory, but unfortunately we have not yet tested this, but hopefully we'll be able to soon. And that concludes my talk for today. So I just want to thank everybody who helped make this work happen, my funders, and especially my graduate students, Kylie in particular for this study. It's part of her dissertation, and she'll be presenting more of the results from that project at INSAR this year. I'm happy to take some questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. This is, again, really interesting study, more empirical evidence coming from your lab. It's really interesting, especially the writing with the awkwardness, and it predicted the cognitive abilities, but not social. I wonder what you think about that. But
well, it predicted worse performance on social cognition. At least the predictions, the perspective is that people who were rated lower on all these trait domains and non-autistic people having lower social interest in them, they were the same people that non-autistic people thought would perform worse on the social cognitive tasks, but that those same non-autistic raters thought they would perform better on the general cognitive tests. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I will start with some questions from the audience. I think there's one comment from Christine that I would like to read. I just want to mention that I'm a moderator in a group where autistic people help parents of autistic kids with parenting issues. And your research on thin slice judgments is by far the research I cite most often in the group. It's incredibly helpful info for parents who mistakenly attribute their kids' social difficulties to problems with the kids rather than problems with the kids' neurotypical peers. So I think it's really good to see that the effect of your findings in implication as well. I
mean, I'll just say, yeah, we've got a lot of attention for those first impression findings, and I think it's wonderful that they've made inroads in autism research and resonate with people's experiences. I don't think that they're particularly novel. And in fact, the response that I got from many autistic participants and adults is that, yes, this is self-obvious to us. But I think empirically demonstrating it, kind of measuring, estimating the size of the effects, and then building from there to try to demonstrate the consequences and implications, and of course demonstrating different kind of reaction from autistic peers and interaction from non-autistic ones, kind of trying to, as I said, develop an empirical basis of the double empathy problem, I think has gone hopefully a long way into making the double empathy problem a bigger part within even mainstream autism research.
Yeah. So there's another question from Dave. To what extent did you take into account masking? Those who are masking in typical social interactions are bound to come across as less convincing and awkward as they're clearly acting. The same is true, I've discovered, of non-autistic people at autistic run events. Even in real life settings, we do not engage with social chit-chat or small talk. Monotropic cognition means we are specialists, not generalist, and so simply do not have the interest in or knowledge of mainstream topics such as the weather, royal babies, or the Kardashians.
That's a great comment. I did not have time to present the breadth of Kylie's dissertation, but camouflaging was an aspect that she examines as a moderator of the effects we found here. She'll be presenting some of that at INSAR. I will say that a lot of our findings are consonant with that comment. For instance, I don't want to give away some spoilers of her her broader dissertation, but we see important context effects that autistic people are perceived differently across contexts, with some of the most favorable ratings for autistic people coming when they were talking about one of their interests. When they are enthusiastic and about the topic that is being discussed, they actually are perceived better even by non-autistic participants. And conversely, we often see that they are evaluated least favorably in the job interview context. And we have lots of factors trying to understand that better, including the degree to which autistic participants did or did not camouflage. The camouflaging measure we used was the CAT-Q, which is a common self-report measure about general camouflaging tendencies for autistic and even non-autistic people. We had our non-autistic stimulus participants completed as well. And unfortunately, it didn't work great in this context because we didn't get an index of camouflaging in the actual videos we recorded, whether participants were doing it or not. And because we were using a young adult non-autistic control group, many of them being university students, a lot of those items on the CAT-Q are ones that are heavily endorsed by that population as well, because there are things like
I often try to hide my true feelings around other people, or I act in ways that are not my true self around other people. And of course, in a socially charged environment like university settings with younger people, we saw high rates of camouflaging being endorsed by our non-autistic participants. So our measurement, I don't think, was ideal here. I obviously think that camouflaging is endorsed as a survival strategy for many autistic people because it produces survival benefit, right? It is being applied and used sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, because it's trying to avoid negative impressions and the consequences of those negative impressions.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to actually ask, in the videos that you used in Kylie's research, you did a rating for all of them, right? You didn't look at a separate video and look at the data and compare from one impression to a certain video and compare to another video in another context. I guess you did.
So every stimulus participant completed all 6 contexts.
Yeah.
Right. And then different raters rated them only in one of those contexts. You saw that she had an enormous sample size that it allowed us to be able to do this and have the power to detect effects. So we were able to compare how autistic and non-autistic people are perceived similarly and differently across different contexts. All of our previous first impression studies were all this artificial context based on, we just took it from a procedure that had been used in previous studies. It was like a mock audition for a TV show, which a lot of participants are like, this is weird. This is not something I would do naturally. And so we wanted to try to capture some more real world scenarios, although it's still under this experimental constraint of they know they're being recorded and we are staging a kind of mock job interview kind of thing. So it's still not completely representing how these things would work in the real world, but we're inching closer to try to see how aspects of context affect how autistic people are perceived by non-autistic people.
Link about the same study, Annabelle is asking, just to be sure, in these last studies, were the NA raters unaware of the diagnosis?
Well, that's another manipulation that I didn't discuss as well. So in Kylie's dissertation, camouflaging is in there. Whether we provide a label that this person is autistic or this person is non-autistic was manipulated across raters too. I'm trying to think back whether that label manipulation had an effect on cognitive estimations. And it may in some respects, but I think it largely did not.
Okay, we have time for a couple of more questions. So Sue Fletcher is asking, such great work, Noah and Kylie. I wonder if you could maybe draw a link from these new findings to the impact of getting or disclosing a diagnosis. Lots of people don't disclose because they're worried about being diminished in others' eyes. Are those fears well-founded?
Yeah, so we have only kind of estimated the effects of disclosure in this really experimental context, which I don't think necessarily translates to how disclosure is received in the real world. So this isn't disclosure in the sense of somebody is choosing to inform another person about their diagnosis, which is a huge consequential decision for many autistic people who have the option of disclosing or not disclosing. Not all autistic people do. Our studies are, we provide a label at the bottom of the screen when they're watching a video that informing them that this person is autistic. And when we do provide that label, we see some benefit in the ratings that they receive from non-autistic people. Not a huge benefit, but a detectable, significant benefit. I think people who have done work looking at more qualitative studies examining autistic people's experiences of disclosure, for instance, in the workplace. There's been some great work on that, showing that the outcomes is highly variable. It's difficult to determine how disclosure is going to be received in every situation, because it highly depends on context. It depends on who's receiving it. For instance, in one of our previous studies,